Chris Rubetto, Digital Cultures. I'm delighted to welcome you here. It's my honor to introduce Gabriella Coleman, who holds the Wolf Chair in Scientific and Technological Literacy at Yale University. She is a graduate of Columbia College and the University of Chicago, where she earned her doctorate in anthropology. Wikipedia also tells us that she did her high school in Puerto Rico, so I should mention that history as well. I don't need to say much about Gabriella and her two very well-known and very well-received books, award-winning, and so I will turn the floor over to Gabriella. We will pause for a moment at 1 o'clock just to allow law students who have to attend their 1 o'clock classes to shuffle out. So thanks very much. Let's welcome Gabriella.
Thank you. So thanks so much for inviting me. I know I was supposed to come here last year and it didn't work, but I'm really happy to be here. And I was going to give a different talk about Anonymous and why they were able to kind of dodge the cyber extremism terrorism framework. And I think it's a really interesting question. And it's a really fun and entertaining talk. But it's also very straightforward in many ways. And then, I knew who was going to potentially be here. And I decided to give a talk about some new work that also draws on past work, but is also a kind of a beginning of a book project. And it's a little bit, I guess, more ambitious, but maybe also in need of feedback in some ways. And also based on an article that I'm revising due in 2 weeks. So in a very selfish way, I decided that I was going to talk about this. However, the original talk actually is relevant, and maybe it will come up during the Q&A. But now I'm just going to kind of jump in. So a couple years ago, I went to DEF CON. And DEF CON is the largest hacker conference in the world, held in Las Vegas. And it's an interesting conference because it's not a particularly political conference. In fact, many would say it's kind of apolitical in some ways. But it's the 20th anniversary, and this is what was written in the program. It says the story of how ordinary hackers tilted the paradigm of technology and power ever so slightly closer to the little guy is important, maybe one of the most important stories of our time. And that really jumped out at me for all sorts of reasons. First of all, again, DEF CON is not particularly political, but here they're sort of saying something has happened. The other thing I like, too, is that while on the one hand it's saying it's a really important story, the role of hackers in shifting, let's just say, geopolitics, power, is still select, right? And so it's not kind of overblown in the way that sometimes, some pundits and journalists overblow hacker politics. So that really stuck out to me. And it stuck out to me because of this. Now, computer hacking in its different forms has always had very political elements. So one of my favorite examples has to do with the Yippies, and this is the Youth International Party Line, a zine that was published with phone phreaks. Phone phreaks were those precursors to computer hackers who used to kind of tap into the phone system. They linked up with Yippies to publish this great zine. It was a kind of like uber political publication. But in many ways, while politics have always been part of hacking, in the last 5 years, there really has been something unprecedented when it comes to different political interventions, genres, and formats with computer hacking. And in some ways, the face of that, in interesting ways, is Anonymous, in part because they're so good at getting attention. But really, Anonymous is just one after one icon in what has been this really interesting tide where there's been this bubbling and proliferation of hacker politics. And it comes in many different forms and formats, right? So there's the whistleblowers, whether it's internal to an organization like Edward Snowden, or those hackers who are willing to break into systems. It comes in the form of free and open source software, where there's a kind of reinvention of the law. It comes in the forms of political parties, such as the Pirate Party. It comes in the form of creating technology, such as Tor, or creating ISPs. And the other interesting thing about it is that it's not just based in the English-speaking world. In fact, I think the global components are the most interesting ones, where there is, unbelievable hacking activity in Latin America, Brazil, Chile. There are all sorts of sort of whistleblowers working in the international context. XNet is one of my favorite projects in Spain, run by a woman, inspired by Anonymous and WikiLeaks. So the story about the proliferation of hacker politics is not simply one that exists in North America. Now, I don't think that there's anything kind of obvious or given about this explosion of hacker politics. This, craft of hacking, which was defined by obscure tinkering. Now, hackers engage in media advocacy, traditional policy and lawmaking, activism, civil disobedience. And so I want to kind of understand, why this activity is happening now and what it is about the craft and culture of hacking that can explain this explosion. And, I have the title Weapons of the Geek, which is a play on Weapons of the Week, the famous book by James Scott. And the reason why I turned to Weapons of the Week has to do with a couple of reasons. It's not just simply a cute renaming of a title. So Weapons of the Week, for those that may not know the book, it's a very influential book in anthropology, political science, where James Scott looks at modalities of political action that on the surface do not look political, like foot dragging, minor acts of sabotage, and says, in fact, this is quite widespread, it's particularly important with peasant populations, and it has massive political impact, right? And so he took something that was not of interest to political scientists in particular and said, you should be paying attention to this. Now, what's interesting is that Weapons of the Geek is almost the complete opposite of Weapons of the Week, with some minor exceptions, which I won't be able to get into. But Weapons of the Geek are visible and dramatic tactics exercised by a class of very privileged actors, technologists, and their allies, who often inhabit the center of economic life. So Weapons of the Geek is its inverse. But the reason why I like it is that I also think certain academics, notably historians and political scientists, have also kind of ignored this domain, with a few minor exceptions. And I think in part it has to do with stereotypes around hackers, and there's been misconceptions that all their politics is libertarian, which I don't think is quite right. And it was only recently when really WikiLeaks entered the political stage in which it was clear that hackers were geopolitically significant, that people started to pay attention. But there is a whole kind of recent history and long history that has been ignored. But I'm also, very interested, again, what I like about Scott's work is that the material conditions of peasants matters for understanding their politics, and I think that's the same for hackers. So I'm also inspired in that way. So basically, this is my overarching question, which is the basis of an article, and again, maybe a short book. And it asks this: why and how have hackers who enjoy a significant degree of social and economic privilege, how have they managed to preserve pockets of autonomy? What historical, cultural, and sociological conditions have facilitated their passage into the political arena, especially in such large numbers? Now this is, got many moving parts, there's many dimensions. I'm only going to be able to gesture at some of those moving parts, but hopefully I can get to some of them. All right. But a good place to start is with hackers themselves. Who are hackers, right? And maybe Colin, who also works on hackers, knows it's a real pain in the neck to define them in certain ways because, I've come across anthropologists who actually have told me flat out hackers are no different than programmers. And I'm like, no, they're different than programmers. They're like programmers, but there are differences, and those differences matter. And yet, even though there are differences, there's extreme diversity within the sphere of hacking as well, which I go to great lengths to emphasize for all sorts of reasons that will become clear in a second. But if I had to, condense what I think hacking is, as a type of technical activity that perhaps is similar but distinct to something like programming or other similar technical arts like security research. I often define it as the intersection between craft and craftiness. And so the craftiness part is going to come later in the talk. But by craftiness, I mean a certain inclination to be devious, to think outside the box, to push against tradition, to engage in the art of trickery, and so on and so forth. And it'll become a little bit more clear in a second. Craft, I mean, this is very simple. All of us in here are craftspeople. We are part of a kind of tradition that is somewhat oriented to questions of quality and excellence in making and thinking, and hackers are quintessential craftspeople. They're stewards of craft tradition characterized by tenacious and lifelong dedication to learning, quality, and excellence. And so much of hacker social organization, whether it's the Free Software Project or security research, is about, upholding the norms and practices so their craft can flourish. But, that's a very kind of like starting point definition. It doesn't necessarily go to many different places. And what's really fascinating and important is the differences. There's tremendous differences that matter in the craft of hacking and thus the politics of hacking. So there's many different ways to approach it, and I've written about this in different ways. One of my favorite distinctions has to do with builders versus breakers. Builders are folks like people who write free software or people who make 3D printers. Breakers might be security researchers or those who have come from transgressive traditions. And it's interesting, this language is actually relatively recent in the hacker world, and hackers themselves now refer explicitly to I'm a breaker, I'm a builder. So that's one way to look at differences. Another way, which I've written explicitly about, has to do with different genealogies. And these different genealogies have different roots and sources and origins. They have different ethics and politics, and they're not, completely distinct communities of practice, but there's enough differences that they matter. And I don't know, I seem to repeat this quite a bit, but then oftentimes more popular writers will be like, hacking has this one origin. It's called MIT. This is where hacking was born. I'm like, well, that was really important, but how about the Greeks? They were not at MIT. They weren't in an institutional context. That was at the same time. And then you have this whole crypto lineage, which also was at MIT, but had a very different emphasis, which was about closing off knowledge, not opening up knowledge, right? And so it's really important to understand these differences because they help us understand why there's no such thing as a kind of unitary hacker politics. And these are only three. I think there's other ones that matter as well. Now, I also like to show pictures that help to show some of the differences between these different genealogies, because it gives a sense of, there are differences. So this picture is of Debian, the largest free software project in the world, which is the basis of my first book. They have a yearly conference, and these are some of the guys that are part of the project, right? Pretty straightforward. Now, compare them to a group that I don't think exists anymore, but they're Canadian-based, or there were a lot of Canadians, and you'll see why. Their name was Haggis, Hackers Against Geeks in Snowsuits. And they were part of this kind of transgressive underground world who actually engaged in proto-politics similar to Anonymous before Anonymous existed. And so one of my favorite website defacements that they did was against Greenpeace when one of their own, Kevin Mitnick was not in Haggis, but he was an underground hacker, was arrested and put in jail. So they wanted to protest the fact that Kevin Mitnick was in jail. So they hacked Greenpeace and had a hippie having sex with a tree. And they write, in elite speak, and I won't read the whole thing, but the next one, says, Also, we'd like this opportunity, take this opportunity to say Free Mitnick, or we're Club 600 Baby Seals by hippies, right? And obviously they're not going to club baby seals, but the whole point is they're involved in transgression and spectacle. Clearly they enjoy doing this. And they're just quite different from the free software hackers who also call themselves hackers, right? So I just think I try to convey this message as much as possible. And I'm going to return to similarities, but I'm just laying some of the differences out. Now another area that helps us understand differences in hackers culturally and politically has to do with place, right? And we are all very close here in Davis to the Bay Area. And the Bay Area has its own very unique culture of hacking that has been, it's been written about very well by folks like Fred Turner, right? And there's a whole sort of interesting relationship to spirituality and New Age and capitalism and politics. And actually, my story can relate to people in Silicon Valley, but it's not primarily about Silicon Valley whatsoever. And in fact, the center of gravity for what I'm talking about is actually Europe, which took me a while to get there, but it was so obvious at a certain point. But place really matters. So here you have, certain hacker values that are really channeled towards capitalism as salvation. And that's very different from, let's just say, scenes in Italy and Spain, where you have, it's complete opposite, where you have very strong kind of anti-capitalism that has existed and been in partnership with some very important organizations in North America, from Indie Media to other collectives. But in fact, Europe is quite interesting because they are home also to a group, the Chaos Computer Club, which is one of the largest hacker organizations in the world, and despite what their name says, are actually pretty organized. There's like little chapters all over Germany. They've been in existence since 1984. They're interesting too because their roots are in the transgressive world, but then they became non-transgressive in certain respects. And I think our history of hacking and our understanding of hacking would be very different had this been our main touchstone as opposed to Silicon Valley, for example. And this provides an alternate history. And the fascinating thing about the CCC is that in some ways they've become just more political as the years go on. And they're very famous for their large conferences. And this is a picture from their one in December where they had a recent immigrant from Africa be their keynote, right? Probably wouldn't kind of have that happening in Silicon Valley. Now there's other regional differences that really matter. Again, Brazil, I think, is one of my favorite areas when it comes to hackers and everything, whether it's free software, whether it's transgressive hackers. This place is amazing. So you might have a crypto party, so a little party to teach people how to use encryption. And let's just say a city in North America, you might draw in 50 people. In Brazil, you draw about 600 people, maybe because it's also a rave at the same time. But clearly there's some really interesting things going on. So I just wanted to give a sense that, hackers come in different sizes and packages. These really matter when we're understanding the politics. But now I actually want to take a step back and say, what is it about hacking writ large, about all these different domains, or many of the different domains, that help us understand what's going on today? And in some ways, my argument is a nested one, where there's certain attributes that relate to other attributes and are reinforced by those other attributes. But one thing I actually am not clear about is the order of the nesting, if that makes sense. Like what's more important, which doll fits in which doll. And currently, the way I have it configured is a little bit random, but again, I don't understand which should be the main big robots. But now I'm going to just jump in and again talk about those qualities in the hacker world that help us understand this explosion. So I think one of the most important has to do with a shared commitment to autonomous ways of thinking, being, and interacting. And I just have a short quote from a hacker that kind of captures the sensibility. Easiest way to get a hacker to do something, tell them they can't. Institutionalized oppositional defiance disorder. And this, is a quote that then opens up to many, many different dimensions, which I'm going to talk about. But I think I want to, first establish something. I think it's very easy to be like, well, this is what hackers say about themselves, and that's just rhetoric, and it doesn't match practice, right? And obviously, as social scientists, we always have to look at that disconnect, and I think there's many instances where it may not match practice. But in fact, what I think is so interesting about the hacker world is I do think this is really connected to their practice at so many different levels. And so in that sense, I'm going to say, being empty signifiers, these habits of thinking are baked into the cultural, political, and technical DNA of computer hacking. And now I'm going to talk about where this actually is practiced in a day-to-day sense. So one just has to do with the craft of hacking. And this does relate to, traditions, technology traditions that have nothing to do with hacking. But to be a good technologist, you have to be kind of anti-authoritarian when it comes to the technology. And certain genres of hacking, like security research, are especially conducive towards that type of thinking. So this is a quote from a security researcher who told me, I wasn't talking about politics with him, I was asking him what it's like to figure out that there's a vulnerability and fix it. And he says you have to have an innate understanding that technology is arbitrary. It's an arbitrary mechanism that does something that's unnatural and therefore can be circumvented in all likelihood. And again, this is not unique to hackers. This is what engineers do. This is what lawyers do. But what has happened in the hacker world is that they've taken this sensibility and have made it into a full-blown cultural practice. And the most fun, I guess, and locatable dimension where you can find this is hacker humor. And I've written about this in my first book, and it was really at, some hacker conference where it hit me that humor was really important when I realized that it was really, really common for audience members to interrupt me or interrupt the speaker to crack a joke, right? This happens all the time. So it wasn't simply like the speaker, and I was like, wait a minute, that's weird because this isn't like a comedian conference. You'd expect that there. So that's where I started really thinking about humor, and once I kind of was attuned to it, it's just kind of like everywhere, right? So programmers embed jokes into their software. There's Easter eggs. They invent entire computer programming languages like brainfuck, which are nothing but kind of humorous ways to mess with people's minds. Again, they're very performative in social interactions where people are joking all the time. And I think, that kind of anti-authoritarian attitude where nothing is taken as given and you're willing to remix it is what comes out in their humor practices, right? And this is another way of sort of saying craftiness, humor is a lived experience. And, if you look at the history of hacker politics, there's many examples of kind of craftiness, bordering sometimes on humor, that, again, exemplify the sensibility. And so, just briefly, two of the most famous examples. One is the copyleft, which, again, is a kind of playful inversion of the copyrights that is used to ensure that knowledge is made accessible. It disables copyright, but uses copyright. And so there's a real kind of craftiness to using the very thing that you can't stand to undo it. And then the other one I really like concerns PGP, Pretty Good Privacy, which is a piece of encryption that was made by Phil Zimmerman in 1991, and I'm going to return to it a little bit later. But it broke all sorts of laws, and one of the laws it broke was ITAR, which has to do with trafficking of munitions. It was illegal, it was considered a munition. And a lot of hackers were thinking, well, how can we export, the source code? And someone got the brilliant idea. It's like, well, you know, a book isn't illegal, right? So let's publish it as a book. And like, you know, some of these hackers like calls up MIT Press and it's like, will you be willing to just publish this book for us of all source code? You know, and it was literally so that they could make the point that you have this law which abridges our freedom of speech, right? So that's another kind of crafty example. Now, along with humor, another kind of way that you can find this anti-authoritarian attitude has to do with the copious writings that hackers, write. And it comes in the forms of everything from manifestos, so when the idea of free software was created, there was a manifesto, to the hacker underground, really loves to write text files and zines. And they're just like dripping with this like anti-authoritarian sort of language. So it's, again, couched very explicitly. And it's found in zines like Frack, 2600, there's a bunch in Europe as well, Haptic, and many, many others. And just to give you a little bit of flavor of what this might look like, this is actually taken from Bruce Sterling's The Hacker Crackdown, which is one of my favorite books on hackers, where he kind of delves into the hacker underground and wrote a really good book. And this is just a collection of some of their text files and zines. And as you can see, they have things that are pretty straightforward, like Hacking Digest, but then there's things like Hacking Bank of America or Electronic Terror, right? And so it's got like this really sort of edgy sort of attitude. And one of the most famous declarations that kind of has this anti-authoritarian stance is the conscience of a hacker, aka Hacker Manifesto. Not all hackers, let's just say from the free software world, will know this, but anyone from the hacker underground will know this very well. And they could almost like recite it verbatim, especially the part that I'm going to include here, which says, yes, I'm a criminal, my crime is that of curiosity, my crime is that of judging people by what they say and think, not what they look like, my crime is that of outsmarting you, something that you'll never forgive me for. And I think like when most people read this, they don't know about hackers, are like white, alienated, privileged teenager who is just like pissed off at his parents, and it's just like, "Arr," But actually what's interesting about this manifesto, and this is moving me forward, is that he wrote this shortly after his arrest, right? And this is a really crucial part of the story of this kind of anti-authoritarian thinking, is that in some ways it has been activated in political ways only because there have been massive legal intrusions in the hacker world, starting with the phone freeze, right? So to put in very concrete terms, the history of hacking and phreaking is just strewn with examples of disobeyed norms, rules, and most profoundly laws, which then just mean that people were always getting in trouble and always getting arrested. And so this is a picture of some phone freaks in California. That's Captain Crunch, a very famous freak. And he was one of many freaks that were not only arrested, but paid visits by the FBI. And this is particularly important to my story because I think it's really this context of state intervention that helps us understand why that kind of anti-authoritarian attitude, which exists in practice, can, be activated in political ways. And what's also important in this story is that the state intervention, especially in the U.S. context, has intensified with each passing decade, right? And so, whereas some hackers would get away with very little jail time, now you have them doing 5 years, 10 years, having huge fines, being put into solitary confinement, right? And so this is a story of intensification, which really matters. It's not only a story of intensification, but I also think one of the key things is that some of the key hacker arrests early on were just like completely so ludicrous, and these are like hackers tend to be like, I'm intelligent, I don't like stupid things. And so having the state go after you and having it be incredibly, stupid is very, very difficult. And this case in particular, this is a case around Night Lightning. That was his hacker handle. He was the co-editor of this zine that was always taunting the FBI, right? They're always taunting the FBI, and then finally the FBI was like, oh, we're going to arrest you and rake you through the coals, and you're facing tons of years in jail. And why? Well, because he published a document that was part of AT&T, and it was a document related to the 911 system, E911. And they're like, this was stolen, so on and so forth. And it probably was stolen, but the thing was, this document was available in the public library as well, right? And so this actually case was interesting because it brought into being the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and he eventually got off. But this was like the awakening in some ways, right? And there's many other cases across, the English-speaking world. Australia was another hotbed of activity where this sort of stuff went on. And so among hackers who are branded by the courts and the media as explicit outlaws, the anti-authoritarianism harbored against institutions, and especially the government, intensified. That's all I'm going to say about that portion of the story. Now I'm going to turn to another portion of the story, which has to do with collectivism and autonomous spaces of hacking. So one of the interesting things is that hackers are often seen as, and they portray themselves as super individualistic, right? And they are in many respects. But the practice of hacking at the craft level, at the social level, at the political level is extremely collectivist in nature. And in fact, I often, am not as familiar with scientists in the academy. I mean, I've read books, obviously, but I'm not hanging out with them. But if I compare social scientists to hackers, I'm like, oh, hackers are way more collectivist and collaborative than academics are. And this is really important for understanding why a group of people who are spouting off really individualistic rhetoric can come together under the right circumstances and act politically. So practices of collectivism and feelings of camaraderie are supported by social spaces, and hackers possess many of these: mailing lists, code repositories, free software projects, hacker and maker spaces, and internet chat relays. And so one point is, first of all, the craft of hacking requires collectivism, right? Like, I can sort of write a book by myself, where obviously I'm indebted to the wider community, but I sit down, I do it by myself, I may, work with one or two other people. Well, for most technical problems, hackers are working in groups, small groups, big groups, and then they have these social spaces, some of which, again, facilitate technological practices, and others which are just kind of social spaces that also engender that collectivism. And at a certain point, I realized that hackers have a lot of what's called free spaces. So there's literature that some of you are probably familiar with, which comes from sociology and the social movement, where people refer to the importance of free spaces, which are like radical churches and co-ops, which are conditions of possibility for kind of social and political movements. There's many people who write about this, but I'll just quote one person, Francesca Paletta, who defines these free spaces as settings within a community of movement that are moved from the direct control of dominant groups, are voluntarily participated in it, and generate the cultural challenge that precedes or accompanies political mobilization. And so on one side are traditional free spaces, and hackers have a ton of them, right? And what's interesting about these free spaces is that they can make them themselves, they can build them, they control them, and that's why they're also, recursive publics, which is a term by Chris Kelty, who writes about the ways in which hackers not only traffic and discourse like a regular public, but build the infrastructures that allow them to associate. So they're free spaces, they're recursive publics. And what's interesting about these free spaces, whether you look at the more discursive elements or the more, offline spaces, is that they work against the fragmentation that exists because of the different genres of hacking, right? So there's big differences. But because some people are reading certain websites and commenting on them, people kind of are staying abreast about what's happening. And this kind of, really rich, I think, public sphere is one reason why you can have simultaneous strong collectivism and fragmentation in the hacker world. And a really important dimension has to do with the hacker conference, which is important for all publics. Publics, really require face-to-face time, as we know. But it's funny because just as hacking became more global and virtual was just the moment that they started to meet in person in the 1990s. And now you have like non-stop kind of conferences. So these free spaces are publics, and they're also kind of counter-publics, I think, insofar as now we're going to return to state interventions again to kind of wrap up. But even though this is a very privileged group of people economically and socially, they are aware that they're often running afoul with the law. And some of them actually really enjoy that. They feel kind of really cool that they're defying norms. So this public becomes a counter-public precisely because of state intervention, which I already alluded to, and I'm kind of I'm getting towards the conclusion of my talk. But I'm going to now return to James Scott, because it was really when I was reading for fun, because I like James Scott, a passage that made me realize just how different hacker politics are. And it was this passage, just one of my favorite ones. Everyday forms of resistance make no headlines. There's rarely any dramatic confrontation, any movement that is particularly newsworthy. And whenever the ship of the state runs aground on such a reef, attention is typically directed to the shipwreck itself and not the vast aggregation of petty acts that makes it possible. It is only rarely that the perpetrators of these petty acts seek to call attention to themselves. Their safety lies in their anonymity. The nature of the acts themselves and the self-interested muteness of the antagonist thus conspire to create a kind of complicitous silence that all but expunges everyday forms of resistance from the historical record. Again, hacker politics cannot be more different. There is I'm releasing PGP. Now the FBI is after me. I'm on the run. The whole community knows. I'm going to print PGP on my t-shirt, right? This is just the complete opposite. And what's interesting is probably some of you are saying, well, not every hacker is breaking the law and involved in law breaking. And that's absolutely the case. But even those genres or communities that don't, like free software, are also getting in trouble all the time. So very famously, DCSS, which is a short piece of software that could be used to decrypt DVDs, was written and released by two anonymous coders in Jan Johansson. And this caused a big legal brouhaha in North America, or the United States and Europe, with lawsuits, people arrested, and this, super politicized the hacker community. This, again, is the basis of my first book. And so you don't have to be a transgressive, law-breaking hacker to actually get pissed off at the state, because if a short software program, is all of a sudden illegal, people in this community rise up, again, for a lot of the reasons I told you about. They're collectivists, they have good channels of communication, when they're pissed off, they like to speak about it, right? Now, when this happened, I was like, oh, this is the apex in some ways of mobilization against the state. Well, then this guy came around, and it kind of changed the game in some pretty fundamental ways. And what's interesting is Assange is one of these figures who comes both from the transgressive community, as well as the free software community, as well as the crypto community. He was really political from the start. He got in trouble. He was arrested. The judge let him go. Probably many world leaders are very upset that the judge let him go. So what's interesting is that this was a game changer in many respects. And I'm going to really conclude with that in a second. But I just want to go back a little bit to state mobilization. So very famously, Lawrence Lessig has said code is law. Well, if code is law and coders write code, well, that also means that hackers, because of their craft, can take command of the law very well, right? And that's an argument I make in my first book, which is like they've created free software philosophy and law because it's really easy for them. Some like the law, some don't like the law, but nevertheless, it comes very naturally. And as we all know here, law is culture in very fundamental ways, right? It's moral, it's ethical, and because hackers have both been in trouble with the law and have also just like learning about the law, they've created a very lively culture around the law. And there's a quote by E.P. Thompson that actually, I think, well, it's not about hackers, but could very easily be about the world of hacking. So he's talking about English society in the 1800s, and he says, I found that the law did not keep politely to a level, but was at every bloody level. It was imbricated within the mode of production and productive relations themselves, and it was simultaneously present in the philosophy of walked. It intruded brusquely within alien categories, reappearing bewigged and gowned in the guise of ideology. It danced the cotillion with religion, moralizing from the theater of Tyburn. It was an arena of politics, and politics was one of its arms. It was an academic discipline, subject to the rigor of its own autonomous logic. It contributed to a definition of self-identity, both of rulers and of rules. Above all, it afforded an arena for class struggle within which alternative notions of the law were fought out. Now, this same quote can be applied to hackers, which is what I do here. And, you know, law is both foe and friend, but it really has afforded an arena for struggle. And it's obviously not really class-related, except for a few exceptions. But as hackers have kind of fought for themselves, fought for the law, they've really developed an extremely deep culture of civil liberties. And the culture of civil liberties can be found in many different places. And I'm just going to signal a few as I truly wrap up. This is a quote by Edward Snowden, who explains that, you know, I'll let you guys read it, but it's, you know, pretty straightforward. He has these commitments to intellectual freedom. He identifies it through the internet. It motivated him to act, you know, to engage in civil disobedience, right? And I think it's just a really good example of how the internet, for many geeks and hackers, is, you know, again, in the words of Chris Kelty, a moral order, but then is really tied in many profound ways to civil liberties. I think Anonymous is so interesting because they, too, engage in this culture of civil liberties around anonymity. And what's great about them, too, is that their manifestation or their commitments to anonymity are both at once very tied to civil liberties, but then also has other dimensions around deception and play and transgression that don't necessarily speak to a civil liberties dimension. But, all right, now I'm going to really wrap up with a story. So, it's called Beyond the Politics of Internet Farming. And this is the one part I'm just going to read a little bit. So, it was January 2015, and after delivering a talk about Anonymous at the University of Toronto, I went out to lunch with a hacker. He's a Dutch hacker in his 40s, now living in Canada. And obviously, you know, given his expertise and interests, the conversation drifted to Edward Snowden. Like so many hackers, it was clear that he experienced the act of whistleblowing by Snowden as an urgent wake-up call. It re-energized his pursuit of privacy. Now, I was not formally interviewing him, but of course, it kind of became an interview. And one of the things that he told me was this. I kind of asked him, like, what do you think is the political significance of, you know, Snowden and Assange? And he put it in a very interesting way. He said, he always knew that hackers would have a political impact, he said, but it would primarily arise in a diffuse fashion over a large period of time, simply by virtue of the types of technologies they built, like the internet. To punctuate this belief, he described hackers as intranet farmers. Just as the rise of agriculture and by extension farmers ushered in massive political and social changes across the world because of these material changes in food production, so too would hackers and similar technologies alter the course of human history by virtue of the technological artifacts they've created. But this explanation was just for context. He went on to express earnest surprise at the current state of affairs, whereby both individual hackers and hacker organizations, many of which were familiar to him, are increasingly taking key and visible roles in sculpting our geopolitical present. As he offered the commentary, I nodded in agreement, and I myself had been surprised by this transformation. I felt like, wow, comparing those ECSS protests that were very contained to Assange, there had been a radical kind of transformation. Never before had I seen so many geeks and hackers wield their keyboards for the sake of political expression, dissent, and direct action. As my conversation with this hacker affirmed, crucial to the constitution of this weapons of the geek have been exceptional events, what historian Bill Sewell calls critical events, that set politics of hacking to a new course. This was Assange, this was Anonymous. The watershed moment, I do think, arrived with Assange and WikiLeaks and the gush of activities that subsequently have flowed due to the activities of Anonymous, the developers around Tor, Edward Snowden, and so on and so forth. But in surveying this kind of explosion of hacker politics and the importance of critical events, it would not do to overemphasize the importance of these critical events alone. Without the social cultural dynamics and conditions inventoried in this talk, such events would never have been possible. In fact, this hacker himself is a quintessential example of the weapons of the geek participant. This is evident from his LinkedIn page, where, along with his many professional work experiences, he lists the following affiliations, a number of which he flags with pride. He's a member of the Electronic Frontier Foundation for 14 years. He's a cryptographer, part of the Cyberterrorism, which was a mailing list. He co-founded a hackerspace in Toronto. He was part of a crypto project called the Libra Swan Project. And he's also part of the Hippies from Hell Hacker Collective, which is based in the Netherlands. Events are not enough, technologies are not enough, commitments to technology are not enough, and communities are not enough either. But it's precisely the dense aggregation of all these things, stabilized by participation in free spaces, hacker collectives, and the greater hacker public, operating alongside anti-authoritarian habits of mind, access to technology, technical proficiency, and respect of the hack as form and function. These things together constitute the resources and infrastructures situated to nourishing desire for an ability to act politically, if and when the right historical circumstances arise. So that's the end of the talk, and thank you very much.